Welcome to Right from the Bible. We continue now in our study of the book of Matthew, picking up in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. We continue now in our study of the book of Matthew. We're going to pick up in chapter 24. Now, when I had begun the last study going through chapters 22 and 23, I made it a point to state that we were going to go much more quickly through those two chapters due to the narrative, the storyline. If we had gone slowly through there, we would have missed a lot of the interaction that takes place between Jesus and the spiritual leadership, that being the Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, and the Herodians, those who had spiritual influence over Israel and Jerusalem. And we would not have been able to see the interaction that occurs between Jesus and that group and how it went back and forth. We also would have missed the interaction between Jesus and the multitudes that were in the temple listening to him teach, and how he was communicating to them about the spiritual leadership that was standing for the most part in his presence. And so if we would have chopped up 22 and 23, I think it would have lost a lot of the impact. And since a lot of it really was the dialogue that existed between and in the midst of those three groups, Jesus, the multitude, and the spiritual leadership, it didn't really lose a lot of its emphasis regarding the theology that may very well have developed through those two chapters. I'm sure that if we were to go through it intricately with a fine-tooth comb, we would develop some important points that, of course, Old Testament prophecy would have helped to bring to light. But what we are going to do now as we go into Matthew chapter 24 is the exact opposite. We need to slow down here because we are getting towards the last message that Jesus is going to present before he gets to sit down with a meal with the disciples. We recognize it as the Last Supper and then his arrest. And so he's going to be responding to some questions that the disciples have of him. And those questions are going to arise because of things that they state to him and his response to him, especially regarding that of the temple. And since they have it fresh in their minds, the things that have been discussed to them regarding the spiritual leadership and in the presence of the spiritual leadership, they've got a lot that's going on in their hearts and minds churning around. But we're going to see some interesting things start to play out here. And needless to say, there is an importance for us to slow down. But as we have done in the past, sometimes as we gear up for a particular chapter, it is to our benefit to go back just a little bit and then lead up to, and in this particular case, Matthew chapter 24. So we're going to go back into Matthew chapter 23, and we're going to take a look at the last 5 verses before we head into Matthew chapter 24. And the reason that we're going to do this, you'll see, will help us to understand a question that is going to be asked of Jesus by his disciples. So let's go back into Matthew chapter 23, and we're going to go back as far as verse 34. And let me go ahead and read them, and I'll just hit on some light points as we move forward. And so Matthew chapter 23, verse 34 says, "Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall you scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar." Now, one of the points that I did not bring up during our last study was the reason that he mentions from Abel to Zacharias is The Jewish Old Testament ended with Chronicles. Chronicles to the Jewish Old Testament was just one book. It wasn't First and Second Chronicles, it was just Chronicles. There wasn't First and Second Kings, it was just Kings. And it wasn't First and Second Samuel, it was just Samuel. And the last individual, the last innocent individual who is killed and recorded within the Old Testament is Zacharias, and the first is Abel. And so Jesus is encompassing all of these individuals who lived righteously and were killed by those in opposition to them, basically of the entire Old Testament. That guilt is now placed upon that of the Pharisees because of their attitude. And so in this first address, it discusses the aggressive manner in which they would reject God and be found guilty for it. That's Matthew 23, verses 34 and 35. And in verse 36, we read, "Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation." Now, this second point, these things, the statement, these things, regards the judgments associated to the rejection of Jesus in his parables. All right? So that means if we were to go back and he is highlighting the landowner that left his land to people that would come in and become tenants to it and would not pay their due, those individuals, those are the things that he is leaning back towards. You'll remember that from our studies going back to chapters 21 and 22 and up to 23. And so in verse 37 and 38, we read, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets and stone them which are sent unto you, how often would I have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." So this third point is their repudiation of Jesus, and it results in an abandonment by God of his people with the removal of the Spirit's work amongst them. And this is important to note, and we're going to see some interesting cross references as we move forward here and highlight this point. Now, one prophetical insight that we may want to take a look at comes from Hosea 6:1 to 3. And let me go ahead and read that. It says, "Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he has torn, and he will heal us. He has smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. In the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. Then shall we know, if we follow on to know the Lord. His going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come unto us as the rain, as the latter and former rain unto the earth." And so if you'll notice in verse 1, when it makes the statement, it says, "Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he has torn, and he will heal. He has smitten, and he will bind us up." It is a direct reference to the house being left desolate. It is a direct reference to Jesus stating that prophetically what would end up taking place, of course, is Titus in AD 70 coming and laying siege upon Jerusalem, and then ultimately burning the temple, taking it down stone from stone, and destroying the city of Jerusalem for the most part, and then resulting in the diaspora. God has turned his face to them, he has smitten them, but he will revive them. And that's why we find so much interest in the restoration of Israel as a nation in our day and age, because we see this as a fulfillment of prophecy and just how close we are to the return of Christ. Now here is something that is a point of interest, in that it is the spiritual leadership was placing an emphasis on the sacrifice of the altar and the gold of the temple. And Jesus addressed the issue by stating that the altar is what sanctified the sacrifice, and that the temple is what sanctified the gold. However, it was the Spirit of God that made the altar and the temple holy. And they had all of these things backwards. And for us to get a better understanding of that, Let's go ahead and take a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. Let me be a little bit preemptive by discussing what Solomon had done in chapter 6. They had come to the completion of the building of the temple in chapter 6, and Solomon goes through a lengthy prayer asking God to have a heart of forgiveness if the people were to turn away from him, and that he now sets forth the sacrifice upon the altar, and the people are, in essence, just asking God to bless this magnificent work. And as it has now come to a conclusion, we end up in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 1, and I read, and it says, "Now when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. And the priests could not enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house." Now, look at verses 3 and 4 and take a note of the condition of the heart of the people in response to the way that the Lord, them seeing the Lord, honor and glorify the house and basically make it holy. Because if you'll remember, anywhere God is at becomes holy. When Moses hears the voice out of the burning bush, it says, "Take off the sandals, because the place that you are standing is holy ground." So let me go ahead and continue to read 2 Chronicles 7, 3 and 4. And it says, "And when all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, they bowed themselves with their faces to the ground upon the pavement and worshipped and praised the Lord, saying, For he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Then the king and all the people offered sacrifices before the Lord." Now I want you to consider how Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem was about turning over the money changers' tables and rebuking these individuals, calling it a den of thieves when it was supposed to be a house of prayer. Look at how these individuals are treating the experience of seeing God glorify the temple and sanctify it by his presence, and lapping up the sacrifice with fire. They were in a state of humility. They were in a state of praise. They were worshiping God at that moment in time. And this is exactly what the frame of mind of an individual should be in that particular circumstance. And it was quite the contrary for Israel and the Jewish leadership in how they were responding now to this. Now, this interesting point occurs now as we continue on. It says their house is left desolate, and this would mean empty. The thought of a shepherd abandoning his sheep, a husband abandoning his wife, of being deserted by the aid and protection of another. That is what the word desolate means. And so when God says your house is left unto you desolate, it was unprotected. And yet they still felt that because they had the temple, that they had the presence of God, and they didn't recognize that the temple was really just another building without God's presence there. And sadly, the same thing is happening in our churches today. The music, the children's ministry, the building, the notoriety of the pastor, the popularity of the church, etc., etc. They take precedent over holding to the truth of the word and living in obedience to Christ. The power of the Holy Spirit and his sanctifying work in the life of the church has been substituted for an emotional experience that leaves a person dying from a lack of spiritual nourishment. An unwillingness to teach the truth of the word and congregants' inability to stomach sound teaching will ultimately result in the departure of the Spirit. Their house will be left to them desolate. There's no difference. it moves away from having this humility of worship and a desire to do what it is that God wants to becoming more about the things that we see. And we'll see more of this now as we pick up in Matthew chapter 24. So let's continue now. We'll move on to Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. And let me go ahead and read it. And it says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple." So now we even see Jesus' disciples, they begin to show him the grandeur and opulence of the temple buildings. Herod the Great had built them magnificently. It was said that no building at that time, including those in Rome, could rival it. According to Luke 21:5, he states that they pointed out how they were adorned with stones and gifts. It would appear that they were influenced in a manner that was similar to that of the spiritual leadership of their day. Misguided emphasis upon buildings and the flash and frill of things that entice the flesh, but without substance to feed the spirit. It was the same thing that they had been caught up in. Remember, if the disciples in their Jewish custom would come at least once a year for the Passover, for the yearly sacrifice, and so they would make the trek from the regions of Galilee to take a look at these buildings, and they were as caught up in their appearance as anyone else was. Let's go on to Matthew chapter 24, verse 2 now. We're going to go on to verse 2. "And Jesus said unto them, See you not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So Jesus now cuts short their admiration of such things by prophesying the destruction of the buildings that they so admired. This would well have set the disciples back on their heels. The temple epitomized God's presence to Israel and their unique status among the populations of the earth. It would become the greatest expression of God truly turning his back on his people. And once again, I reference back to Hosea chapter 6, verse 1. This had to have been just a shock to them to hear about the temple being leveled as Jesus had prophesied. Let's move on to verse 3. "And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world?" So, after leaving the temple now and Jerusalem, he goes to the Mount of Olives and he sits down. In 1 Samuel 1 through 4, it discusses the rebellion of Eli's sons and Eli's unwillingness to address their sins. God was seen as cohabiting with his people, represented by the presence of the ark. During a battle with the Philistines take the ark. Eli's sons are killed, and Eli dies when hearing the news. His daughter-in-law gives birth at that time and names her son Ichabod, because the glory of God had departed Israel. Jesus now has left Jerusalem and is sitting on the Mount of Olives. The Jews had missed the time of their visitation, and the glory of God had departed. If we were to look at Ezekiel 10 through 12, we would see a resemblance of actions by God and his withdrawal from the temple and Jerusalem. Within that passage, the cherubim with 4 faces are seen. The faces of an ox, a man, an eagle, and a lion are seen as representing the 4 characteristics of Christ. The presence of God is seen in the temple. He then goes to the threshold of the temple. Next, he is at the east gate, then settles on the Mount of Olives. In that passage, he will tell of the coming judgment upon Judah. Their house will be left desolate. They will be scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. Many parallels are found within the Ezekiel passage and easily measured against Jesus' statements and actions found here in Matthew chapter 21 through 24, culminating with Jesus exiting Jerusalem and sitting on the Mount of Olives. Matthew indicates that the disciples come to Jesus privately. The place where he was sitting appears to be at a distance from where they were at, giving the impression that he may have desired some solitude. His earlier statements were now churning within them, and their unsettled thoughts were desiring answers. There were three questions of which they desired answers. The first emphasizes these things, as earlier stated, a direct reference to more than just one prophecy made earlier. The second, what shall be the sign of your coming? They saw the prophecies as distinctly different. The third, with the thought of signs being recognized to herald the end of the world. It is interesting to note that they saw Jesus' return and the end of the world as two different events. One of the things that touches me when I, if you will, imagine myself, if I was one of the disciples viewing Jesus, is him going through everything that he had went through in the temple, in the combative nature that took place between him and the spiritual leadership, looking upon the multitudes and doing all that he can to instill truth within them, and then coming to the place where he now exits and sees within his own disciples their passion for the things of these buildings, these man-made buildings, and then the exiting from Jerusalem, this place that he had desired to have their willingness to follow him. How long have I desired to have you drawn unto me, but you would not. And then the walk that would take place coming down from Jerusalem through the Kidron Valley, back up to the Mount of Olives, and then just taking a seat on the Mount of Olives. And we don't know whether he was looking back at Jerusalem at this point in time, whether there was just this meditative thought, if you will, of what was actually occurring and where they were now at in history. But I can't help but thinking that he just wanted this moment to be alone. There are just times where you are going through things that maybe only you see, or the insight that God is giving you, and being with others and trying to share it is just a very shallow experience. But for him, being God and knowing the end result of all of these things, that they were ultimately rejecting him, I can't imagine what was going through his heart and mind at that time. I just can't imagine what was going through his heart and mind at that time. Verse 24:4, it says, and Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceives you. Take heed that no man deceives you. His response to their question is stated in the imperative. Take heed. This isn't merely a request, but a command. The idea is to maintain observation. Keep your eyes open to what is coming. It expresses the thought of always being on the lookout. The idea is not merely the use of the eye gate, but to include the discerning mind. The purpose for taking heed would be to maintain a defense against deception, that no man deceives you. The word means to be led away from the truth, to err to sin, or to move away from the truth, as if so one doing it on their own or of their own volition. It is written in the third person subjunctive, which means that it was not just intended for those in his immediate hearing, but to anyone who would desire to follow him. The subjunctive means that there was the possibility that there could be a positive outcome or a negative one, depending on an individual's willingness to exercise the command to take heed. We will have to interrupt our study there. Join us again as we continue on in our study of the book of Matthew. And until next time, may the Lord richly bless you as you continue to grow in the grace and the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ.